All right. Hi, everyone. So, this is the next video in a series of our 9 step process called Clarity, the 90-day data stack that helps our clients go from no analytics function or a limited analytics function to one that allows them to make data informed decisions and really drive a culture of accountability, relying on key insights to make strategic business decisions on a regular basis. So, we've talked a little bit about in past videos. Step one, most important thing is to define your primary KPIs and the actionable metrics that build up to those KPIs that your team can actually control. So you could check out that video separately. And that's a really important part of this entire process is making sure that we're working towards the right end goal in mind. But this second step in the process, once we've kind of outlined what our key metrics are and their supporting metrics are, then we know, okay, we need to figure out where to go get that data from. So that's what this second step is all about. It is, we call it audit data, but it's basically you've defined your KPIs and now we need to go find where we're going to get that data from. So this one isn't rocket science, but it's really just making sure that before we go too far down the path of building your data stack, that we take the time to make sure that there's not going to be any blockers to getting to the information that we actually need. And if there are going to be blockers, how are we going to solve for them? So I'll just walk you through a very simple framework, just a basic spreadsheet that we use to help classify where we're going to get the data from. And then from there, we can plan out what will the architecture for your data stack actually look like. So one of the other videos I've recorded, we talked through what it means to define your KPI. So what's the KPI? How frequently do you want to measure it? At a high level, what's the source for this metric? So that's the first exercise that we would go through. But once we've created a laundry list of your primary KPIs and the supporting actionable KPIs that build up to those, then we would take that information, review it, and start to make a list of what are all of the sources of your data. So this is just an example of a few sources that we often help clients integrate into their data warehouse and then BI tool, visualization tool for reporting. So Stripe, Google Ads, Sage Intacct, or NetSuite or other ERP systems. Line is a kind of a one-off source that we've implemented for a client in the past. It helps with marketing data for healthcare companies. Maybe your company has an internal budgeting process that you want to be able to view in your BI tool. A lot of companies have this concept of the location and region mapping. If you're a franchise business, for example, and you have 100 locations across the country, you probably break your business down into potentially like districts, regions. You might have like a regional manager. We can help you map that data into your data warehouse. A lot of companies have an application database, so they might be running some sort of software, or a SaaS company might be running on like an application database that lives in Postgres, but you don't want to use that database for your analytics purposes. You want to replicate data from there into something like a Snowflake or a Redshift or a BigQuery, and that's something else that we can help out with. Most important step, make sure that you've outlined what are all of your sources that we want to have in the warehouse. And then from there, we will help propose a method of extraction for each of the sources that you need to get into the data warehouse. We have a placeholder for relevant documentation. This is mostly important if your source is going to require like custom API development to extract the data. And then this is just something that we use as a helper. Like, is it going to be high, medium, or low level of effort? And it might help prioritize where we spend our time when designing your architecture. So the key considerations that we go through when defining what should be the method of extraction for each of your data sources are kind of across these 5 buckets. What's the ease of transfer to the client? If you're a client that is planning to hire a data team, like a data engineer and a couple of data analysts, then maybe it's okay if the data transfer process is a little bit more complex in favor of flexibility and lower ongoing cost for the method of transfer. But if you're not really planning to build on a full data team, then it might be better to pay more for a tool that kind of does that work for you so that there's less maintenance required. And so even if the tool itself costs more, and you don't need to hire somebody to maintain it. So that's the trade-off we consider there. Cost in general is a consideration, but again, a lot of times the trade-off between cost is, do you want a solution that might require more maintenance or a hands-free solution that won't require maintenance, but is generally going to be a higher cost? A lot of times we're evaluating tools, ETL tools like Fivetran or Airbyte is one that we like to use a lot because it has an open source offering. I've heard of Stitch, Portable, a few others. And a lot of times what we'd like to do is look at what are all the sources that you need to replicate and which of those kind of out of the box tools covers the most number of sources that you need, or covers at least a couple of the sources that you need, but maybe is able to handle the most complex data source that you have. So for example, I've worked with a few APIs like the NetSuite and Sage Intacct APIs that can be more difficult to handle or work with from like a custom Python development standpoint. And so if there's a solution that's within client's budget to just replicate that data via one of these out of the box connector tools, then we might make that recommendation. It doesn't mean it's not possible to do from a custom development perspective, but that might be something that's worth considering. Reliability of connectors. If we're going to use an out of the box ETL solution, definitely want to make sure that it's reliable. So some of that we just are at South Shore, some of that we're just familiar with our personal experience using some of these tools in the past, or we'll do a little bit of research if it's a tool that we haven't used yet or a connector from a tool that we have used, but haven't used that specific connector yet. Like, how reliable is it? Are there any concerns from other customers using that connector? And then learning curve. If there's a connector that is only available in a tool we haven't used yet, we'll consider using that tool, but going to want to make sure that it's not terribly difficult to figure out how to use it. Otherwise, it might be just as easy for us to set up some custom development. I'll actually put another one on here just so I can talk about something else that we dealt with fairly recently. For example, I'll use Airbyte when I'm talking about these pre-built connectors because that's like the one that we use the most often at South Shore. But we also have a lot of experience working with Fivetran, a little bit of experience working with Portable. So Stripe, what you'll see in general is that like the most common data sources are supported by the large connector tools. So like Stripe and Google Ads, no matter which kind of connector tool you're looking at, you're going to be able to use it for sources like that. So for here, I'll just put Airbyte. We'll put Airbyte for Google Ads, Sage Intacct, maybe Airbyte, custom development. I'll go back and show you how we do that research. Line, just from my perspective, custom Python dev. Internal budget. This is a situation that we typically like to maintain a Google Sheets workbook that can be updated by your team or certain members of your team on whatever cadence you'd like to. But then we use like an Airbyte job to basically capture updates for that Google Sheet on a daily or more frequent basis if you need it. So typically we'll go with something like this, Google Sheets, Airbyte. Same thing with the location region mapping. If you are, like I said earlier, trying to map certain of your locations to a broader geographical region, this is another way that we would set up that flow of source data. Application database. Typically, we've done some custom Python dev for this. This is something that you could do via Airbyte or Fivetran, but honestly, we've found that it's almost just as easy to do custom Python dev for this. And then you have more control over it using an orchestration tool, which we'll talk about in another video in the series. But for now, I'll just say custom Python dev. There are other, like Snowflake, for example, has native connectors that allows you to directly connect your application database to Snowflake, but we've seen potential cost issues with some of those tools with clients in the past. So usually we'll just set up a job that's super cheap on Lambda, AWS Lambda, and then feed the data to S3 and then copy it to Snowflake. So that's a pattern that we've seen a lot of times. We had an interesting use case a while back with a client that had dozens of on-prem MySQL databases. and we wanted to unify the data from those MySQL databases into one location. So we actually worked with a third party IT firm to set up like a hub and spoke VPN network where we deployed an EC2 server that had one server that served as primary VPN hub. And that server stays on 24/7, but it doesn't have a lot of resources associated with it. But then we set up basically another EC2 server that is one of the hubs that's connected to the VPN. And then we connected each of the on-prem remote servers to the VPN. And so that way we basically used our secondary EC2 server to write a custom Python script that extracts data from each of those dozens of locations to a central location in S3 all over VPN connections. I know that's a complex setup, but I just want to highlight a situation like that where if we're dealing with a data source that isn't as straightforward as the vast majority of data sources will be, we can still work with you to figure out a solution. And so that's why it's helpful for us to build this framework so that we can really think through and architect how we're going to do these types of things. So this is going to be like custom EC2 setup Python. And when it comes to documentation, we'd build internal documentation here. Same here. This one, these two like link to align API docs, link to Sage API docs. So we would just keep this as a reference point. These would be NA if we're using a tool like Airbyte. Same with this. And then this is like where we would just help prioritize our efforts like this. And then when it comes to making a final decision on one like Sage Intacct, we've done this via custom development before. Maybe what I would do is take a look at Airbyte connectors. So can I find Sage? I don't believe they do support Sage Intacct. For example, they do support NetSuite. I want to say they support a few of the other finance and accounting softwares. So that's always something to consider when you're choosing your tool for transfer. But one thing that we wouldn't want to do is set up 2 or 3 different connection tools. So we would do a lot of this research on the front end to see if a tool that we'd like to use covers all the connectors that you need. And if not, can we find another tool that does? Like, for example, we might be able to find I believe Fivetran does offer a Sage Intacct connector. So that could be an argument for let's at least do a cost benefit analysis of should we use that connector as opposed to Airbyte in that instance. But again, Fivetran typically a little bit more expensive, doesn't have the open source offering. So if possible for us to rely on Airbyte and then build custom solutions for data pipelines where possible, that's usually the route that we'll prefer to go. So yeah, that's a little bit about how I would say in this case, we'll probably land on custom Python devs. That's a little bit about how we just game plan where are we going to get the data from. And once we have this with our list of KPIs that we want to support, we can start to blueprint the overall system. So I'll talk about that in my next video. But basically the concept of blueprinting is, all right, what are we going to do to automate the data extraction? Are we going to use some sort of orchestration tool? Orchestra is one that we've been using a lot lately. Dagster is another one that we've used in the past, especially when we're getting deep into custom Python development. So we'll talk about that more in our next video, and then we can plan out what the outputs look like. So your dashboards, your automated reporting. If you're a company that's going to be in a position to start leveraging AI in your operational processes, like how do we do that? So look forward to talking to you more in the next one.